Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us virtually here from Euclid Public Library. Our special speaker today is Mr. Greg Miller. He and his wife, Ann, they are local Euclid residents as well as Euclid Library patrons. And they're here to talk about a location I'm sure many of you are familiar with, either as visitors or as just driving past the road, and maybe you might have always been curious about it. The Our Lady of Lourdes National Shrine, located just off of Euclid Avenue. Here to speak about it again in more detail is Mr. Greg Miller.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My wife and I, as Frank mentioned, live in Euclid. We often would go up to Our Lady of Lourdes Shrine to pray. My background is that I practiced law for 20 years and then was called along with my wife into full-time pro-life ministry. In that context, I was up at the shrine in prayer in June of 2016. Just praying a rosary in the grotto area, and I felt prompted to go into the gift shop. So upon going into the gift shop, I was speaking with the nun who's in charge of the gift shop, or who was then, Sister Margaret Mary. She said that there was a legend that the Blessed Virgin Mary had appeared on those grounds to the woman who at that time, along with her husband, was working the hillside to turn it into a vineyard. And I asked Sister for the details about that legend. She says, well, Greg, I'm really not supposed to share it with you because we're not sure what's fact and what's fiction. And so she shared with me what she knew of it at the time, and she admitted to a lack of certainty about a number of the items. So I said, Sister, well, as it happens, this summer, I'm on sabbatical from the ministry. I'd be happy to research it for you. You probably aren't aware of the fact that before I became an attorney, I was an historian, degreed and certified and published and the like. So she said, oh, that would be wonderful, Greg. She said, of course, many of the records are at the diocese and the archives. Still other records may be with the Good Shepherd sisters who had owned the land and had been the order in charge of the property at the time that the shrine was first built. So with Sister's blessing, I went about the search that led to quite a few places, most notably the Euclid Historical Society, where we found that the story was really mistold in so many respects, misremembered in so many respects, and the various hands, left, right, and otherwise, didn't really coordinate well. So it was providential that in 2016, this research was undertaken. What I came to learn, along with the assistance of the archivists at the Euclid Historical Society, the Diocese of Cleveland, the Cuyahoga County and Ottawa County, and Cleveland Plain Dealer and Cleveland Public Library, Good Shepherd Sisters archives, was a fascinating story that had so much more to it than any of us had really suspected. The story, as it were, begins in the 1850s with the movement of a family by the name of Harms, Judith, as was her given name, Julia is what her family and friends called her, along with her husband, Louis, and a number of other German residents in the area of Prussia, moved from Germany to what later became known as South Bass Island and Put-in Bay. They had moved from Germany ostensibly because of the civil war that was going on within Germany, as it were, their war of revolution, emerging from an imperial model or a monarchy model to a democracy model there. And so they transplanted here to the Lake Erie Islands. When they did, they brought with them their knowledge of grapevines and winemaking. And so they actually became among the very first planters of grapevines and makers of wine in this part, not only of Ohio, but of the country. The Harms family and the related families, the Stook family and the like, are all part of the history of viniculture and viticulture, as they call it, here in Ohio and in the Midwest. So they settled there in the 1850s, and then, as you're probably aware, in 1858, the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to Bernadette Soubirous in Lourdes, France. Now, why jump over to France? Well, because of course, Our Lady of Lourdes Shrine here in Euclid is integrated not only in terms of its name, but also in terms of its history with the developments there in France. So in 1858, the Blessed Virgin appears not to a group of people, but to one person, to one woman. And the miraculous healings that result from the water being taken from a spring that was there at the grotto. Those similarities are carried over to the Euclid shrine, as we'll later see. So then that's 1858. The following year, 1859, another fascinating apparition tied in ways that one wouldn't otherwise suspect to the Euclid shrine. Another fascinating apparition takes place, and that's in Champion, Wisconsin. Now, this is a church-approved shrine. The Blessed Virgin appeared there as Our Lady of Good Help, following the apparitions, again, to just one woman. And following those apparitions, the local bishop approved of the dedication of a local shrine there. Again, that's important because many years later, it would be rededicated as a national shrine to Our Lady of Good Help. And that ties into what it is that happened here in Euclid. So that's the 1850s, the movement. The Harms family from Germany, along with other German immigrants from Prussia during their civil war there, to the Lake Erie Islands, specifically to South Bass Island, the planting of grapes there, the 1858 apparition of the Blessed Virgin in Lourdes, the 1859 apparition of the Blessed Virgin in Champion, Wisconsin. So then we move forward to the 1860s. And in 1864, 1865, Louis Harms, Julia's husband, he's having a falling out with his dad. They're all grouped together, all those German immigrants, multiple generations, all in that Put-in Bay area. Louis has become a successful winemaker and grape producer, and he's just not seeing a future there to raise his family in those close quarters with his dad. So he sets out to make a separate vineyard here in Euclid, to which he could transfer his family in time when the vineyard is ready to support his family with grape production and wine production. Now, viticulturists and viniculturists will say, viticulturists are those who produce grapes for sale. Viniculturists are those who produce grapes for wine production. That they will all acknowledge that it's a minimum of 5 years before the vine can produce a mature grape, a grape that's drinkable, as they say, where it's not producing a bitter one. So that's important because in 1864, they're buying up this property, 80 plus acres on the hillside of Euclid. And, uh, and back in Put-in-Bay, Lewis is putting in arrangements with his partner to sell his interest in their wine production and their vineyards. His partner is a man named Stuck, Leopold Stuck. When the vineyards will be mature enough here to produce drinkable wine and to support his family. So Lewis is laying all the groundwork for that. He brings his wife here for the spring pruning of the vines and the preparing of the vineyard and the preparing of the hillside. And so in 1870, Lewis with his young wife, Julia, well, at that point, they're probably born in 1923. We know as Lewis's, so what's that make him 47? And Julia a little bit younger. So they are here on the hillside, working the hillside, and Julia is on the hillside praying at her favorite spot where she goes every day to pray the rosary. Julia was a very devout Catholic. The Blessed Virgin appears to Julia and says to her, "In 3 days' time, you will give birth to your child. Soon thereafter, you will be called home. Keep this spot sacred or precious in memory." So she relates that to her husband, to Lewis. 3 days later, she gives birth to her infant daughter, obviously very premature. Naturally, Julia, if she had been expecting to give birth anytime soon, wouldn't have been away from the family compound in Put-in-Bay, wouldn't have been on a relatively isolated hillside in what was a relatively undeveloped area, Euclid, which was more territory than village even at that point in time. And so this was an unexpected delivery, but predicted by the Blessed Virgin. So the baby is born May the 1st. There's a gravestone in the Euclid Cemetery, actually a sizable one, infant daughter of Judith and Louis Harms, died May 16th, 1870, lived 16 days. Soon thereafter, you will be called home, was the second portion of the prophecy. Obviously, with that first portion having already taken place, the family gives great credence, if there was any doubt before, to what it is that Julia has said about her conversation with the Blessed Virgin. Julia herself dies August 12th here in Euclid, according to the Cuyahoga County records. Now, they don't state any reason for death in the record. And the records, as they were entered, they looked like they had all been entered like 20 or 30 at a time because of the penmanship in the record. So when they would get to certain deaths, they would leave the cause of death blank. In other words, it wasn't anything suspicious. We surmised, but this is deduction, not fact, that it was due to the complications from childbirth, because when she was buried, she wasn't buried here in Euclid on that hillside. She was buried back at the family cemetery in Put-in-Bay. And she was buried on August 15th, 1870, which of course is the Feast of the Assumption. So Lewis then continues to work the hillside, but he's left with 4 children, ages 12, 8 to 12. 8 was the youngest. That was Richard, and then Julia, the daughter, then Louis Jr., then the oldest, who was Carl or Charles. And so then Louis remarries, and he marries the sister of his partner in the vineyards and wine business, Leopold Stuck, his sister, whose first name was Hulda, Hulda. Hulda gives Louis 2 more children. And so with that, they now have 6 children to care for. Louis, that in 1872, he marries Hulda. 1876, he sells his business to his partner, Leopold, who is Hulda's brother. They move the family here to the Euclid hillside, to the land that had become Harms Farms, as it was known. That is, they produced grapes and, as I mentioned, wine, but also produced, they had fruit trees in terms of their orchards on the hillside. The Harms Farms development is marked in a notable and, in a sense, misleading way. That is, in the area of the grotto, there is a large stone there, a capstone, which is engraved 1876. And so the Euclid Historical Society and others had assumed from that Louis had purchased the land in 1876, and that stone was to mark that. Of course, our research into the Cuyahoga County land sale records in the county plots showed that he had actually purchased the land back in stages between 1864 and 1865, so that by 1870 they were starting to get to the point where they could first have some drinkable grapes. But now by 1876, it's ready to produce a mature grape crop across the hillside, which then can produce enough wine to support his family. So the 1876 stone there is actually from the permanent residence. Prior to that, they had a temporary home, kind of a chalet, as it were, in which they had lived. It had been built on the hillside. So 1876, we've got the family there with the 6 children, and Hulda feeling somewhat overwhelmed. And so then what starts to happen is they start to get some help on the hillside. The first help that arrives is in the nature of the Good Shepherd Sisters. The Good Shepherd Sisters are a religious order based in Cleveland, locally, downtown Cleveland, but globally, their mother house was in France, in Angers, France. And the Good Shepherd Sisters attended to young ladies who were involved in prostitution, and they were seeking to bring them out of prostitution. And this was in the industrial age. These young ladies were called Magdalens, after Mary Magdalene, and so they would be brought both for income producing purposes and as labor to work the hillside to pick grapes, and also as their therapy, as it were, to rehabilitate them, bringing them from the industrialized downtown area of Cleveland out to the hillside in Euclid, to Harms Farms. So this was a regular activity through which the Good Shepherd Sisters then got to be close with and really part of the Harms family. The next step was the Good Shepherd Sisters were tied into the Harms family through the Catholic Church, the leaders in the Catholic Church. Locally, St. Paul's Parish on 200th Street was the only Catholic church in the Euclid area. And the pastor there was Father Martin. And his journal entries in the diocesan archives show that he would come out every week on Friday to pray on the spot where the Blessed Virgin had appeared to Julia, and to spend time with the Harms family. So the Harms family, Mr. Harms had marked the spot as Julia had requested, that is to keep it sacred or precious in memory. He had marked it with an evergreen on each side of the spot where the Blessed Virgin had stood. And then he would share this story with others, and others would come to pray on this spot. And others included in this instance, the pastor of the local parish for the area, Father Martin from St. Paul's, and also very notably the first bishop of Cleveland, Bishop Gilmore, after whom Gilmore Academy is named, and who founded the first seminary here and started the Universe Bulletin. Bishop Gilmore would come out once a month to pray on that hillside at that spot, and then also to dine with the family, as the journey from downtown Cleveland was a sizable one before the road system became developed. So Bishop Gilmore in the 1880s and 1890s, even after Mr. Harms Sr., Louis Harms Sr., passed away in 88, would be coming out here. Father Martin would be coming out weekly. And before Louis Harms Sr. passed away in 1888, in 1885, he hired to assist his wife, Hulda, with the children, with the housekeeping, a German housekeeper who spoke German, Rita Stein, and Rita became yet another extended member of the Harms family, knowing, of course, the children very well because she was their nanny, and also knowing the history well. In fact, Mr. Harms said to Rita, as she was sitting on the hillside in the same spot that Julia had been in when the Blessed Virgin had appeared to her, he said to her one day, "Do you know why you and other pious women are drawn to this spot?" And she said, "No." And he proceeded to tell her the story with regard to the apparition of the Blessed Virgin to his wife Julia, with all the prophecies entailed in the confirming developments. So 1885, Rita Stein is hired. 1888, Mr. Harms Sr. passes away. The care of Harms Farms is then passed down to his children, to the oldest child, Charles, and to the second son, Louis Jr., and then to another Harms family member when Louis Jr. became more involved in civic affairs and later became one of the first mayors of the city of Euclid. Actually, it was the village of Euclid at that time. I want to say it was about 1910. So the Harms Farm business and property and affairs are passed down to the next generation. And that's very important because the point is it remains in the family. And that's the case all the way up to 1919, when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution is passed, the prohibition. And so with prohibition, you now have the sale of alcohol being prohibited. Of course, that dramatically affects their wine selling business, which also in turn dramatically affects their grape selling and grape growing business. So with that, the Harms children decide to sell off their 80 plus acres of hillside. But true to the promise that they had made to their mother, Julia, they keep sacred or keep precious the spot where the Blessed Virgin had appeared. So they sell off to commercial developers the rest of the hillside, but the portion of the hillside that surrounds the area involving the spot where the Blessed Virgin had appeared, they sell to the Good Shepherd Sisters. Now, it's very important, though. This was property, and as we saw in the archival records, was among the most valuable property in all of Cuyahoga County. Why would that be? As Euclideans, we kind of scratch our heads and wonder about that. Well, you have to realize that in those days, this Euclid was part of the Millionaires Row, the wealthy area and the like. And so this was the end of the streetcar line, and you had the wealthy moving out from the city where they would keep a townhouse to the country. And so Euclid's hillside here provided a panoramic view of the lake. And so the appraisals of the property value on that hillside were out of sight because the wealthy wanted still to have the convenience of the transportation into the city, while at the same time to have freedom from what was becoming a very densely populated city. So this hillside with its panoramic view of the lake was valued very, very highly. As a result, the 30 or so acres that were sold to the Good Shepherd Sisters was sold for a pretty penny. In 1920, they purchased it for $100,000. $100,000, 6% note on that. Now, part of they paid $75,000 to the Harms family, and then $25,000 to the Steinbrenner family. And I'm not certain whether that's related to George Steinbrenner. I didn't get that far into the research, but suffice to say that they owned a portion of the hillside that the Good Shepherd Sisters also wanted for purposes of moving their convent and their school for the Magdalens, and the home for the retired sisters and the like out to the hillside. So they pay $100,000 for that property. Why is that so important? Because this wasn't being given to them for $1. This was something that they highly valued, highly prized, because they knew the sacred history of this property. In fact, when they bought the property, they didn't, in the county books, they didn't call this in the plats Good Shepherd Sisters, okay, where you would typically have the name of the owner on the property. Instead, they called it Providence Heights. Providence Heights, as in Providence has sent miracles here. Now, I use the term miracles in the plural, and I'll explain that in a moment, because what we find out in the investigation that takes place in 1927. But for the moment, I'll just note that there was another apparition of the Blessed Virgin that was publicly attested to, credibly attested to, in 1912 on that same hillside that was reported in the Plain Dealer. So plural. So Providence Heights, they've spent $100,000 to buy this land to build on hillside, which is not ideal for a school or for nuns and the like, okay, so as to keep this property sacred, because they have been part of the Harms family, and the Harms family does not get their full fair market value of the property that the appraisers had said it was worth, but they sell it at a discounted, even if still pricey amount, to the Good Shepherd Sisters. So you then have that in 1920. 2 years later, 1922, in Angers, France, where the mother house for the Good Shepherd Sisters is, for the entire order, the mother superior, the superior general for the entire order passes away. So the mother superior from the provincial house here in Euclid and mother superiors from around the globe are traveling then to Angers, France to elect a new superior general. The Mother Superior from Euclid was Mother Mary St. John Birchmans, Mother Birchmans for short. Mother Birchmans is taking two of the other nuns from here in Euclid with her to Angers, France. And en route, they decide to take a 1-week excursion to Lourdes, France, to visit Lourdes. Now, very notably, the Blessed Virgin had appeared in Fatima in 1917 and was witnessed by 100,000 people in the field and the miracle of the spinning sun, and reported in newspapers all around the world. So Fatima was the latest and greatest and hottest of the Marian apparitions. But they're going to Lourdes because it's en route for them as they're heading to Angers, France. While she's in the grotto at Lourdes in prayer on the Mother Superior, she hears the Lord tell her that she is to build on the sacred site in Providence Heights here in Euclid, which is what they're calling the property, Providence Heights. She's to build a replica of the grotto there in Lourdes. She goes and shares that, and here the priest who had been showing them around, Father Eckert, Père Eckert, who was a hometown boy who, when he was ordained, was given shards of stone on which the Blessed Virgin's feet had rested in the grotto at Lourdes when the Blessed Virgin had appeared to Bernadette, to Saint Bernadette in 1858. Père Eckert says he had been told in prayer he was supposed to give these shards of stone to these nuns from America. So the word he receives in prayer, his inspired word, is confirmed by the word that she had separately received in prayer in the grotto, and they both feel affirmed, so that the connection will then be made between the shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes in Lourdes, France, and the shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes, the grotto in Providence Heights, Euclid, Ohio. So Mother Birchmans comes back with the other nuns from France, and she is sharing with the bishop here, and the bishop says, Bishop Schrems says, you need to get together all the funding necessary to build the grotto. You can't go into more debt. You've taken on debt in order to purchase the property to begin with. So if you want to do this extra project, it needs to be fully funded, cash in hand first. That bishop's name was Bishop Schrems. He also was German, yet another German in the mix. And he had been born in Germany, and he had moved here from Toledo, so he was unfamiliar with the history of Providence Heights here in the Cleveland Diocese. And he had just moved in the prior year, 1921. So 1925, a wealthy woman approaches the Good Shepherd sisters, asks them for prayers for her seriously ill child. The sisters agree to pray for the child. The child receives what the wealthy woman conceives to be or perceives to be a miraculous healing. And so then the wealthy woman says, how can I repay you? And they said, well, we do have this request from Lourdes to build a grotto here, a replica of the grotto. And we have the request or the order directive from the bishop to have the funds in hand first. And she says, how much? They tell her how much, and she writes a check for the full amount. So now they have the cash in hand. And so the bishop gives them his written approval, go ahead, and you have my permission to build the grotto. So that was 1925. They complete the building of the replica in 1926. He comes out to dedicate it. There's a lot of fanfare. There are thousands of people on the hillside, even though it's raining like crazy at the time, several thousand people there for the dedication of this local shrine. It's called a local shrine to Our Lady of Lourdes. Bishop Schrems has dedicate it, that's usually the end of the story. Except that he then heard, as did his secretary, Monsignor Habig, about this history of apparitions, alleged apparitions on this hillside called Providence Heights. Tell me about that. And so Mother Birchman's sends him correspondence. And in the correspondence, she says, I believe both of these apparition stories to be true. First, the story involving the apparition of Blessed Virgin to Julia Harms. And here is a sworn affidavit signed by Rita Stein, the housekeeper and nanny for the Harms family and the Harms children. And 3 of those 4 children born to Julia and Louis Sr. are still alive and living in Euclid. Louis Jr., his older brother Carl or Charles, and younger brother Richard. So they're offering the testimony of what has happened, detailed testimony from Rita Stein and the children. But over and above that, she says, here is the the plain dealer story that predated your arrival here in Cleveland, Your Eminence. This was in 1912, April 11th, 1912, where the Blessed Virgin appeared to Joseph Geisler. Joseph Geisler, who was he? He was a German atheist who was a journalist who wrote for several international German journals. And he wrote diatribes against Catholicism and against theism in general as an atheist. And so he was really quite famous or notorious, depending on your perspective. And he had a friend here who lived in Euclid. Joseph himself usually resided in Milwaukee, but he was here visiting his friend in Euclid, who was a devout Catholic and was a landscape artist. And the landscape artist had taken Joseph up to the hillside of Providence Heights. I'm sorry, this would still have been Harms Farms in 1912. Of Harms Farms, he's got a beautiful view of Lake Erie from there and of the landscape. He's working on his landscape artwork with his easel set up, as it's described in the Plain Dealer article. And Joseph Geisler, ironically, is off to his side, sitting on a bench under an acacia tree, working on his diatribe against Catholicism. And then Joseph lets out a shriek, and he drops to his knees, and he's speaking, but no sound is coming from his lips. His friend is watching this, and he's scared for him. And then Joseph is unconscious. So his friend runs to get medical help. The medical help comes to him, provides, and then Joseph explains all that had happened to him. The Blessed Virgin appeared, spoke to him and with him at length. He is now a believer. He is converting to Catholicism. That story is a lengthy story then reported in the Plain Dealer because Joseph is such a famous journalist. So Mother Birchman's believes both of these accounts to be credible, relates them to Bishop Schrems through his secretary, Monsignor Habig. Monsignor Habig and Bishop Schrems conduct their investigation in 1927. Again, the shrine's already been dedicated. It's already a dedicated shrine, the local shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes. There's already the grotto there. But he's conducting this investigation anyway. At the end of 1927, he announces that he is going to, in 1928, dedicate rededicate the local shrine to be the national shrine to Our Lady of Lourdes. The American shrine, the national American shrine to Our Lady of Lourdes. Now, what's the significance of that? He brings in luminaries in the church from Washington, D.C. and from Cincinnati. Why Cincinnati? Because Cleveland was under the Archdiocese of Cincinnati at the time. So he brings in Archbishop McNicholas from Cincinnati and a luminary by the name of Burke. I don't remember whether he was a Monsignor or a bishop from Washington, D.C. But these notables, and then leads a citywide procession of 10,000 people to the hillside to rededicate the shrine on the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, October 7th, in 1928. Why is that so notable? Because, as I mentioned before, in Champion, Wisconsin, where the Blessed Virgin appeared to Ms. Breeze, there was the local shrine dedicated to Our Lady of Good Help, and it remained Our Lady of Good Help, a local shrine from the 1800s. 1859 was the apparition, from the 1800s all the way until when? August 15, 2016, when I'm doing my research on the shrine here in Euclid. At the very time I'm doing the research here, and we're wondering about the significance of the rededication of the shrine as a local shrine to a national shrine, we received news through the Universe Bulletin here in Cleveland about what has just happened in Champion, Wisconsin. And that is the bishop in Champion, Wisconsin has finally come to the conclusion at the end of his investigation about the authenticity of the apparition, reports of the apparition there in Champion, Wisconsin, those stories are worthy of belief. Those are the magic words used by the bishop, worthy of belief. And so with that, the shrine can now be rededicated as the national shrine. So when I'm meeting with the archivist down at the diocese, that archivist is likewise saying, wow, this is pretty timely in terms of its coincidence with our investigation. And it really does explain why it is that Archbishop Schrems rededicated the shrine as a local shrine after his investigation in 1927. Why do we need to work from an inference? Because one of the points of frustration is the diocesan archives in Cleveland are very incomplete when it comes to the years, the decades of Archbishop Schrems' tenure. He was bishop in Cleveland from 1921 to 1945, and they're missing huge portions of the records from his tenure, including, unfortunately, any records from the investigation itself. So how do we have these others? From related correspondence files, where it wasn't the investigation file, but it was in a real estate file, or it was in a file related to the Good Shepherd sisters, or related to Father Martin, and so on and so forth. In other words, in these secondary files. But as it were, the mother lode still has not been discovered in terms of the investigation files at the diocese. But it is certainly, from a historian's standpoint, a reasonable deduction. In fact, arguably the only reasonable deduction would be for rededicating with such fanfare just 2 years after the original dedication, rededicating it as the national shrine right after you've engaged in your investigation in 1927, that he must have concluded that it was worthy of belief. That is the Judith Stein, or the Regis Stein account of the Blessed Virgin's apparitions to Julia Harms back in 1870. So what other evidence do we have with regard to the bishops crediting Rita Stein's account of what happened, and presumably the accounts of the other harm's children who were still alive in 1927, there to be spoken with by the investigators? Well, actually, quite a few. 10 years after the rededication in 1928, there was a booklet for the 10th anniversary to be circulated. It included the Rita Stein account plus some supplements to that account that sound like they may have been gotten from the other children and or from speaking with Rita Stein. Okay, but suffice to say that that this amplified account that is in the booklet is given the nihil obstat in imprimatur by Archbishop Schrems. Nihil obstat is Latin for nothing obstructs or nothing stands in the way. There's nothing wrong with this or harmful. Imprimatur is Latin for let it be printed. And of course, at that time, printing presses, this was a term used going back to the Middle Ages, let it be printed is the same thing as let it be published by all the means necessary. So this is the highest form of approval for a bishop with regard to written materials. And he had given this to the circulation of the account. So the account that I'm sharing with you was approved of by Archbishop Schrems with his nihil obstat in imprimatur. That is, let it be printed, let it be circulated, let it be published. There's nothing wrong with that account. Okay. Likewise, years later in 1945, in 1944-45, it was approved again by Archbishop Schrems and by his successor, Archbishop Hoban. Tens of thousands are congregating at the Lord's Shrine. Processions are coming there multiple times a year, citywide processions led by the so-called sodalities of the Knights of the Lord's Shrine and the Knights of Columbus and so on. The Pope himself had given special blessings to those who came to the shrine to pray, plenary indulgences and partial indulgences that were granted for periods of 7 years and then renewed for additional periods of 7 years, first beginning in 1929 because Bishop Schrems had made a special trip to Rome after rededicating it as a national shrine and got the papal blessing for the shrine. Okay, and for those special indulgences, those special papal blessings were extended again for periods of 7 years, one after another into the 1970s. So this was approved of over and over again. The latest of the approvals took place in 1956 by then Archbishop Hoban and his auxiliary bishop, Bishop Kroll. And Bishop Kroll later became Archbishop Cardinal Kroll of Philadelphia. So these are bishops who had received special favor from the papacy throughout their tenures. These are not ordinary prelates, and they had received extraordinary elevations to be named an archbishop over a diocese. It's not an archdiocese, is a very uncommon thing. And that honor had been granted to Schrems and to Hoban alone in the history of Cleveland, the Diocese of Cleveland. Likewise then to Bishop Kroll, who became Archbishop Cardinal Kroll in Philadelphia, where it is common because it's an archdiocese. So we have all of those extraordinary signs, extraordinary blessings. And then what happens then at the end of the 1950s is 1959, Pope John the 23rd says he's going to convene a Second Vatican Council. That Vatican Council is actually gathers between 1962 and 1965. After the Second Vatican Council, Marian devotion declines around the world. People are praying the rosary less. they're devoted to Mary less. They're speaking to Mary less. Why? Well, because it's all part of the belief that that will interfere with the new movement of being ecumenical toward non-Catholic Christians. And so by 1978, the nuns who were running the Lourdes Shrine, the Trinitarians who purchased it from the Good Shepherd Sisters in 1952. In 1978, the nuns of the Trinitarians are printing a history of the shrine, and they omit the apparition of the Blessed Virgin to Julia Harms. They've simply stopped sharing that story. It went from being authenticated or approved, officially approved, official ecclesiastical approval in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, to the 60s, wiping out Marian devotion, and the 70s. Now we can't even remember our history. So by the time I'm coming along in 2016, and Sister Margaret Mary, the historian at the shrine, is saying, Greg, I personally believe this, but we don't know what of this legend is fact or is fiction. I'm being asked then to clarify and to complete the research that none of them were authorized or able to do. And so I completed that research. I submitted my reports to the diocese and to the nuns at the shrine, and I thought that was the end of it. Well, then 4 years later, in 2020, while I'm in prayer, the Lord prompts me to write an article for the Euclid Observer, because I hadn't stopped to think about it. But this was 2020 was the 150th anniversary of the apparition of the Blessed Virgin to Julia Harms. And so that article I submit to the Euclid Observer. Here's there it is, or sort of, okay. It's printed somewhat miraculously on the front page with a full color picture, and then on the inside on page 5, the full top of the half of page 5, top half of page 5. So that's what was being circulated, and word of that article reached the people here at the library. And with that, I was approached and asked to present this Zoom report. I think that completes the cycle and the story. With that, I'll take any questions in the remaining few minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, as I unmute myself here, of course, our attendees, they're free to unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question, or if you'd rather type it into the chat window there at the bottom, that's fine too. I do have a question though. As Euclid was changing from farmlands to suburban and industrial areas, were there a lot of attempts, particularly in the 20th century, to like buy out, maybe turn it into like develop it into residencies or business areas?
Yes, excellent question, Frank. When the Good Shepherd Sisters were in charge of the shrine from the time they purchased it in 1920, turned it into and built the shrine on Providence Heights in 1926, the dedication. They then sold it in 1952. The diocese structured a deal whereby the diocese, namely Archbishop Hoban, paid the Good Shepherd Sisters $100,000 for the property, which was consistent with one of the offers the Good Shepherd Sisters had received. And then sold it to the Trinitarians for $50,000. So the diocese itself ate the $50,000 difference in order to keep it from being developed, because was such a, the property was in such demand, and the Good Shepherd sisters now needed money, okay, to build their new home. Their new home, incidentally, became the property that is now Boyd Mayor Seminary out in Wycliffe. Okay, so that area was all built to begin with as the new home for the Good Shepherd sisters and Mother House, and for the Magdalens and the school for girls, the Angel's Guardian, and the retirement village, as it were, for Good Shepherd nuns.
Thank you. And also, full disclosure, Mr. Miller and I are in the same room. That's why he was looking off to the side rather than into the camera.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Yes, I have a question and comment.
Yes.
Mr. Miller, I really enjoyed your program. I love to go to the shrine. And I would like to know, where did the Harms family live? Where was their house when they came to Euclid?
Great question. To the extent that, well, okay, so they had two homes. Initially, they had a chalet that was built on the hillside, and to the best of my understanding, in speaking with the then expert on the property, and that was John Williams. John was the president and the archivist for the Euclid Historical Society. He passed away last July, at the age of 86. My understanding is that the chalet was, as you're looking at the grotto, was off to the left on the hillside. And then the permanent home that was with the large keystone, as John described it to me, again, if you're looking at the grotto, would have been off to the right, and in the area where the chapel is now.
I do see a comment left. One of our viewers remembers going there to visit every Sunday in the 1950s.
Yes, yes. Well, in the 1950s, you would have then seen that the priest presided for the Mass from an altar on top of the grotto, okay? In other words, on top of the cave, or the cove in which you light the candles that is behind the current altar. So he was up there for visibility purposes, because the crowds were shoulder to shoulder down below in the area where there are now the benches. And of course, that area has been shored up with all sorts of engineering and landscaping improvements so that you don't have the continual erosion. But in some of the photos, including a photo from 1941, shows how the crowds, when they would gather up there, they would be in suit and tie and everything, but they would just be scrunched in like sardines, you know, for the liturgy, and the priest would be in full vestment up above what is the grotto area that as we know it now.
If you'd like to see programs like this, or actually on any topic, always let us know, and we'll try to book them as best we can. And also, thank you everybody for your patience, technology-wise. Even 2 years in, it's always a little tricky to make sure Zoom is working correctly for everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.